This is an art medium known as Scratchboard. Never heard of it? Me either. Stay tuned to see how this was made. Welcome to Handmade, a series about artisans and craftsmen who use their creativity and skills to make unique works of art. In our modern world, it seems like everything is mass-produced, pre-packaged, and available on Amazon. So it's easy to forget that some things are still made by hand. So come on, let's go visit the studio of today's featured artisan. Judy Lavoie has a Bachelor of Arts degree and taught high school art for many years. Then she started a graphics art business and produced artwork for corporations.
My goal is really to create art with a soul, something that the viewer can bond to beyond the technical or the mechanical aspects of the work.
I know you're an award-winning watercolor artist, but how'd you get involved with Scratchboard?
Well, it was sort of a normal transition in that Scratchboard is actually two different surfaces. There's a black Scratchboard and there's a white Scratchboard. And I was at a watercolor convention and there were some free samples of the white Scratchboard, which is a surface that you apply color to before you start scratching. And so I brought some home and I tried it with watercolors. And I'm a real detail person and I just love the effects that I could get by using this medium. And it was a long time after that before I actually tried the black Scratchboard. And that was more of a transition because if you look at my watercolors, they're very colorful. And all of a sudden I was limited just to black and white. So it was a challenge, but I'm always up for a challenge with my art.
What are some of your favorite subjects?
Well, if you look at my artwork, a lot of people say, you do so many different things. How can you change all the time? And maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing. You know, some people say, choose your signature item and paint that. So I guess if I was going to classify my work, I'd have to say it's rural living. But actually, a lot of the reason why I'm drawn to paint a certain thing is not always the subject matter, but it's more of the lighting or the composition, other elements of design that come into play when you create a painting. Is
your personality reflected in your art?
In that my art is very detailed, yes. I majored in art in college, but I also trained as a commercial artist, and that's how I spent my professional life. And as a commercial artist, you have to pay a lot of attention to detail.
Right.
And that carries over. And also, if you look at my watercolors, they're not fluid and loose and pastel-y. They're very rich with colors. And so I think the fact that I was a graphic designer greatly influenced my painting style. And for years and years, painting was just my moonlighting job, but still the two balanced each other and affected each other.
When you're working on a piece, do you see the finished result, or is it something that just sort of evolves as you're working on it?
Actually, I usually have the finished painting in my head before I start. I work from my own photographs,
okay.
And so that's a part of it. And as a graphic designer, I worked in Photoshop for years and years, from version 1.0. So lots of times, if I take a good photograph and I compose it well, I can work from that one photo, but sometimes I take many photos and I combine them. I'm anxious to show you some samples of what I've done because I think that they illustrate the process the best.
Great, so let's go in your studio and have a look. So this is where the magic happens.
This is my work area, Greg, and I want to show you a few things to help you understand Scratchboard a little bit better. It's really a basic, simple process. Back when I was in elementary school, I remember the art teacher having us rub different colors of crayon and then put black crayon over it and use like a wooden skewer and scratch through it. And that basically is what techniques I use doing my Scratchboards these days. That's just a real primitive form. So a Scratchboard that I most often use is a hardboard panel, and there's a sealer on the hardboard so that the wood fibers don't give off anything that might discolor the artwork in the long term. On top of that panel and the sealer is a layer of white kaolin clay. And then the final layer is a very thin coating of black India ink. So it doesn't look like much when you get it. How do you create a piece of artwork on that? Well, basically it's a process that's called subtractive art. So I have to use something that's sharp or abrasive to cut through that thin layer of black and reveal the white layer below it. And that's how I create a scratchboard. So I made this panel where it shows the different steps in the process. And this is actually a kit that Ampersand puts together. So at the top quarter of this panel, I've traced my design onto the scratchboard panel, and I'll show you how I do that with transfer paper. And then you start scratching. You can be as basic as an X-Acto type of knife in doing the scratches, and with this kit, Ampersand actually includes this scratch knife, which has a fine point. Yes, and this is a sort of like a speedball nib, and it pulls out of the handle, and there's other shapes that you can put in there. But I'll show you. It just takes a very light touch to make scratches into the board. And if you run your finger over that, you really don't feel that I've gone any depth.
No, you can't feel anything at all.
That black layer is so thin that it doesn't take much effort to do it. Now, watching me do scratchboarding is one of the most boring things that I could invite anyone to do. Now, there's a lot of tools that you can use for scratchboards. As I said, a lot of artists just depend on a number 10 blade and an X-Acto knife. The company that makes these panels also makes a nice beginner toolkit, and these tools are actually available individually as well. So you see this knife tool that I first showed you,
right?
And there's another tip that comes with it, which has more of a curve, and so you can actually get a little bit more off. You don't want to make your lighter shades by going deeper into it. You make your lighter shades by revealing more of the white with more scratching, so overlapping the scratching. But there's some really cool tools in this kit. You can see how this one is just a series of squiggly pieces of wire.
Oh, wire, yeah. So if you wanted to do like cross-hatching or something?
Yeah, or fur. And then there's another tool in this kit. It's called a fiber brush. And there's actually this rod that's fiberglass.
Oh, yes.
But they're all stuck together. And when you use this, it creates a wider area, and also it's sort of a softer effect. And this is another thing that's helpful for people who are just starting, and if they want to try a lot of the different tools for scratching, because the different tools make different thicknesses of line or might need more pressure to make the scratch into the black. So Greg, I want to show you a little bit about the process I go through in preparing to work on a scratchboard. I mostly work on my own photographs, and I take a load of photographs. This is my cat, Frankie, and I wanted to do him, even though he's a black cat, on a black scratchboard, because it's the drama and the highlights of the light hitting his fur that will really stand out against the black background. Anyway, I take my photograph. He's got brilliant yellow eyes, and they just weren't showing up as well in that photograph, so I just took a little piece of another photograph to emphasize his eyes. When I do an animal portrait, you go directly to the eyes.
Directly to the eyes.
You've got to have those, you've got to nail those. I very often, when I'm working on a scratchboard, change it into a black and white, because that allows me to better see the range of gray values from black to white and all of the tones in between. Sometimes I play around with filters in Photoshop too, So just as an example, this is that little clip of his eyes, and I applied a filter called photocopy, and it really brought out the contrast between the black and white areas. So then my next process is to print it out the size of the board I'm going to work on, and in this case it's a little 6" by 6" board, and to transfer the artwork, my sketch, my photograph to the Scratchboard, I use a transfer paper, and it's like old-fashioned carbon paper, except that it's not an ink that's being transferred. On this one, this is a white transfer paper, and it's like a fine white chalk. My drawing through the white transfer onto the black board.
So you just get some reference lines started, his general shape of his face and his ears and things.
I don't really need a lot of detail. I just want to define where the value changes are as a guideline to myself. My first step in creating the Scratchboard would be to take my X-Acto knife and I go over these lines that I've made, but I'm not going to trace an outline because that would look really awkward in the end. I'm going to make little marks that go in the direction that the fur grows.
Oh, I see, like you did right there.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so that way, eventually, it's all going to blend in and it's going to look much more natural when the artwork is finished. So these are a couple of examples of works in progress. So here's a tiny little Scratchboard, and here's my reference photo. Not a photo I took myself, by the way. So you can see my guidelines.
Okay, that's the transfer, and here you've actually started working on it.
Yep, and you're close enough to see the tiny, tiny little marks that I've made.
Tiny, jeez. Wow, it's
So
amazing.
that's why you can get so very detailed. And here's another, just a simple ball of twine, and I just hung it on an old rustic cupboard that we have in bright light, so I got the drama of having the shadow behind it. And in this one, for the background of the wood, you can see that I've made my marks go in the direction of the wood grain. I used some of those tattoo needles so that I could get a lot of little lines. And then when I worked on the twine itself, I worked mostly where the twine was in a compact ball first, and got those textures, and I got the twisting look of the fibers. And then as the very final step, I took one of my knives that made a slightly thicker line, and I just in a single stroke,
fibers,
single stroke scratched those fibers, which gives it so much character.
When you're working on this as a beginner, what do you do if you make a mistake?
Ampersand that makes the Scratchboards themselves makes this little bottle of magic. This is called Black Repair.
It's like white out on the old typewriter?
Exactly. More commonly, the word Scratchboard defines the black.
The black, okay.
Yeah. But the process is the same. This is called a clay board, also made by Ampersand. And the way you use this is you think of it like it's a piece of white watercolor paper.
Okay.
So you're adding color, but then you go back in with the same scratching tools and you remove the color and you get back down to the white. So it is a scratchboarding process, and I'll show you some examples of artwork that I've done. This is just a little tiny landscape done with watercolor on the clay board, and I actually started sort of like this, where I randomly applied color and I let it mix, and then I decided, well, that kind of looks like a blue sky at the top and some kind of ground at the bottom. As I showed you, you can leave the Scratchboard as a black and white, but it's nice also to add color, as I did with the pansies that I showed you a while back. So this is a black Scratchboard. I used a lot of different techniques to reveal the white below. When you're creating fur, you can do your scratches, and then you can add color where you've scratched, and then you can scratch those areas again too. So you're layering, and that's what makes it more three-dimensional. The color is not opaque, because if I start painting with an opaque tube of acrylic paints, I'm going to cover up all this scratching, all this detail that I've worked so hard to create. The colors that I really favor are these Scratchboard clayboard inks, also made by Ampersand, and they've made them so that they work beautifully on their Scratchboards.
With their base product, right?
And part of that is that they're very, very transparent. But another part of it is if I were going to take this finished board and I wanted to add some color to the fur, well, when I paint this fur with a golden yellow color, probably some of that ink is going to get on the black background.
Right.
And I don't want that to create a film because I'm going to be able to see it. Ampersand has formulated these inks so that it will color where I paint it, but even if I get some on the black, it doesn't show. I never run out of ideas. In fact, the subjects seem to come to me more than I have to go looking for things. I have more paintings in my brain than there are hours in my life, I think, because there's just so many things that inspire me, and it's my passion.
You're a working artist. How do you market yourself?
It takes a lot of time and effort to market yourself. I mean, you can be the best artist in the world, and if you don't get your work out in front of someone, nobody's really going to know it. Or you can be a terrible artist and a wonderful marketer, and successful, yeah, financially successful that way. But I enjoy competition. I like the word determined more than competitive to describe myself. But I enter a lot of competition. I like to show my work. I figure the more I sell, the more I can justify doing because there's only so many that you can stuff under your bed. And so marketing was actually part of my career as a commercial artist. So a lot of it comes naturally from that end. You know, I can create my own website and I can design nice looking business cards or collateral pieces. I did a lot of PR for companies, so I'm comfortable doing that for myself, as much as I can do.
What words of wisdom would you give somebody who just wants to get started in Scratchboard or actually try it?
I think for anyone who's interested in art, just keep trying. You know, they say about golfers, the more I practice, the luckier I get. Well, it's that way with anything. The more you do art, the better you're going to get, and the more confidence you're going to build up to. It took me a long time to actually tell people that I'm an artist. There's a big confidence level because you're putting your heart into it and you're putting it out for people to see. And so it does take a lot of practice and time. One of the things that I do with my art is I like to share what I've learned. I do a lot of that through workshops. I've made videos. I do a blog. I'm very active blogging about my art, and I show my processes, and I show my mistakes, and I show my successes. I show what I've learned. Wow. And I just want to help other people.
Now that you've seen a Scratchboard artist at work, I hope you have a greater appreciation of the time and talent that it takes to make something by hand. It takes passion, practice, and time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Handmade.